Tonight we're going to examine again the assignment that you did, in which you looked at the cultural images of God. You looked at the Psalms, you looked at the Gospel of John, and then you looked at contemporary culture. And we're going to integrate that into what I consider to be one of the most important topics that impacts us as Christian anthropologists, the whole topic of God and culture and the need for a theology of culture. So tonight we're going to be talking about three major points of discussion, namely the cultural images of God, which were the papers that you turned in. We're going to talk about the theology of culture, and there are three particular positions that we're going to look at. Now, there are other variations of these, but these are the three most important: the God in culture position, the God against culture, and the God above culture. And then we're going to talk about the theology of transformation. And in the course of all of this, we're going to be challenging some existing theories, some existing paradigms, and we're going to, I trust, come to a better understanding of the manner in which God works in and through culture. So let me begin by asking you to reflect back on those papers that you wrote. You were asked to read the first 50 Psalms and to come up with a number of the images that you found in the first 50 Psalms. And one of the things I suggested that you do was that you try to categorize them according to some unifying traits. Now, did you find some of those traits? Did you find categories in which to place various of these cultural images of God? What were they? What were some of the ones that you found?
Shepherd.
Shepherd. Okay. And how would you categorize the shepherd image?
Agricultural.
Agricultural, right. Okay, so you've got agricultural images. What else have you got? Duh. Let me give you a hint. Warrior images, all right? Or protective images, if you would. Let me not further embarrass you on the camera, even. Oh, yes. Let's just look at the ones, at least, that I found. Pastoral images, protective images, warrior images, leadership images, and images from nature. Now, I came up with at least 5 categories of images. Now, it's very possible that you could have come up with different ones, but at least these were the 5 that stood out in my mind. Let's take a look at some of these in detail. Under the pastoral images, what did you find? You would have found this one that you just mentioned, shepherd. I would have put in this category as well that God is like a mother hen, protecting her little ones. Have you ever seen a mother hen protecting its chickens, its little babies? If you haven't lived on a farm, you often think, what's a mother hen like? But I was sitting one morning in my living room in Irian Jaya. I'd gotten up early and I'd lit a fire, and I was waiting for my first cup of coffee to come into existence. And I was sitting looking out the window and having my devotions and thinking, and there was a chicken, just plain old ordinary chicken out there, with a bunch of little chicks all around it. And they were out there eating worms or whatever in the wet grass, when all of a sudden a hawk just dropped out of the sky and grabbed one of those chicks. And as it started to take off with that chick in its claws, the mother hen literally fluffed itself up and flew in a rage at that hawk and knocked it down. Actually knocked it off. And every time the hawk tried to lift off, that mother hen would hit that hawk again and keep knocking it back down to the ground until that hawk finally let go of the chick and took off, because it could not get airborne as long as this mother hen kept knocking it back down. And I thought, what a marvelous thing to watch, that mother hen running around, warning the other chicks to run for cover, and then aggressively attacking that hawk. This is what God does. He protects us, and He makes sure that if we come under attack, that He will be there to fend for us. Well, protective images were very, very common throughout those Psalms. Let me give you some examples. A stronghold, a refuge, preserver, savior, deliverer, rock, fortress, horn of salvation, rescuer, strong one, powerful one, guardian, healer, hiding place, watchful eye, contender, protector. I mean, all of these under this idea of protective images that were given. You get the picture of a culture that felt vulnerable, were at the mercy of other powerful nations all around them, and needed this sense of protection. And so they've got all kinds of images that reflect the desire for God to watch over them. Warrior images. When you're in the midst of a vulnerable kind of situation, you need somebody that will become more than just a protector, but become aggressive against your enemies. And so what do we come up with in the warrior images? We come up with images, at least the categories that I come up with. He's our shield, our swordsman, archer, the subduer of our enemies, avenger, Lord of hosts. He's our commander. All of these very military kinds of categories. And then I came up with a group of images that I would put under the area of leadership. Somebody who has a powerful role in our culture. Righteous judge, lawmaker, battle trainer, chief, instructor, guide, counselor, or you could even put commander in here. And then I came up with still one more, and that would be nature images. He is our rock, He is our light, He is the ruler of nature. And I wasn't quite sure where to put that, whether that should go under nature images or leadership images. But all of these images of God that are drawn from the life and culture of Israel. Now let me ask you a question. How many of you came up with 30 titles under the Old Testament, under the Psalms? How many of you got at least 30? How many of you got 50? Wow, there's at least 100. There's at least 100 in the first 50 Psalms. So if you did not get 50, well, let me put it, I started at 30 because I expected you to get 30. If you did not get 30, slit your throat. Well, not quite that bad, but I was expecting you to get it, 25 to 30 as being fairly average. Most students are able to get that many, but some of the better students who really look at this and really work on it are able to come up with as many as 100. Well, what's important about all of this? Why go through all of this exercise? Well, it seems to me that there is something very, very important about the exercise that you just engaged in, and that is that ancient Israel formed conceptual images and linguistic metaphors that were culturally appropriate expressions of their understanding of who Jehovah was. And that Jehovah expressed himself in culturally appropriate manner so that people could understand him So that these terms were terms that Israel was using as a part of their everyday experience of God's self-revelation, of God's mercy and presence in their midst. And it's in a manner that is culturally appropriate, and they are responding with cultural metaphors and symbols. Now that's first principle that we want to deal with. Now we want to move beyond this period. We want to move up to the period of the Gospels. We want to move up to the time of Jesus. So I've asked you to read Gospel of John. And I picked the Gospel of John on purpose. You see, because Matthew continues to use the metaphors of the Old Testament. He's, after all, writing to an Old Testament audience, to a Jewish audience, people who are familiar with those metaphors, and so he continues to use them. But John, on the other hand, is trying to address, if I understand my Bible at this point, is trying to address a Greek audience, see, a non-Jewish audience. And he's going to be using some expressions now that are much more common to the philosophical world of the Greeks. And as a consequence, what are the images that begin to emerge from the Gospel of John? Well, I find at least three major categories. Terms that reflect a philosophical orientation. Secondly, I discover a series of terms that acknowledge occupationally specialized roles. And I find terms that fall into a category in which the purpose and meaning of life are being examined in a way that the Old Testament folk in the period of the Psalms were not thinking about life. We're talking about meaning and fullness of life, which is something that comes after you begin to feel secure in life, after the security needs are met, after the self-preservation needs are met, after the food needs and survival needs are met. We begin to move into the area of what is the meaning of life? How do I find fullness in life? And this was what was happening in the Greek and Roman world at the time of the writing of the Gospel of John. So I find these new sets of terms now, and we want to look at how some of these came out. What were some of the philosophical terms that came out of the Gospel of John? Well, John starts out, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Very, very philosophical concept. But not just the Word. You have a concept such as the light of the world. God is grace. God is truth. God is the bread of life. He is the door, the way, the vine. He is perfect unity. All of these very, very fascinating new ways of thinking about God in terms of his relationship to life and to meaning and to thought, to purpose. So, new sets of terminology. Then I suggested that there was occupational specialization, and look at all the occupational roles that are assigned to God. Messiah, Christ, the Anointed One, Rabbi, King of Israel, Teacher, Prophet, Savior, King of the Jews. He's a vine dresser. He's a good shepherd. He's a healer. He's a judge. Every one of these occupationally specialized roles. Back in the time of David, you had people doing a little bit of everything. See? Farmers were both farmers and merchants. Judges were both judges and merchants. You had the collapsing of specialization into generalized roles, but they are becoming much more specialized now, and this becomes a way of life and a new way of thinking about who God is and of describing his character and purpose. Well, what happens when we move into the meaning and fullness of life category? Well, there's a whole another group of terms. Glory of the Father, fullness of God, He's the anointed one. He's the life giver. He's the resurrection. He's one with the Father. He's lover. He's compassionate. He's the comforter. He's our helper. He's our overcomer. See? All of these terms that help us to think in terms of a better way of life. And what is it that the New Testament says? I am come that you might have life and that you might have it more abundantly. See? I mean, this is a very, very modern kind of a concept. It's a concept that comes after you've dealt with some of those more fundamental issues of survival and safety needs, as you'd find in, say, Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. So, what do we find in the New Testament? We summarize it by saying, in the culture of the New Testament, Jehovah is imaged in terms appropriate to a people seeking spiritual and intellectual satisfaction. He is the answer to spiritual hunger in humanity. With these new conceptions, people are able to worship him in spirit and in truth. Now this is a whole new concept now, to worship God in spirit and in truth, rather than the older concept of worshiping him through sacrifices, through visual images and all. Well, how many of you came up with 30 terms from the Gospel of John? Oh, come on, more than that. 4 or 5? The rest of you are not telling. Because if you didn't get at least 25, slash a wrist. Well, no, don't do that. But I was kind of hoping you'd get at least 25 or 30, because once again, some students have come up with up to 100. Now again, some of these are, variations on a theme, but at least 100 different terms that you could come up with from the Gospel of John. Well, what happens if we move up to present day? How well did you do on the present day? Did you find that more difficult? Because there's no standard text. I can't say, go to this text and look. Well, here are some of the categories that I came up with that categorize contemporary terms that describe God. I come up with categories such as awesome power, that God is an awesome power. I mean, you see that in our God is an awesome God. He's an awesome God, but he's fairly distant. And then I come up with terms of endearment. Then I come up with terms that reflect a democratic social structure. And then I come up with terms of companionship or helping. Now, what are some of the terms that show up when we talk about God as an awesome God, but a very distant God? Well, we've already given you one. Our God is an awesome God. We can talk about he is a power greater than ourselves. See? We can talk about him as being the force. See? May the force be with you. See? And there's a whole group of these really kind of ominous kinds of things of God being an all-powerful God. But there's just one problem. As God begins to move up in power, he has to become increasingly powerful, because all of a sudden we have developed awesome powers. See, we've got atom bombs now. Oh, nuts on atom bombs. We got hydrogen bombs. Oh, nuts on hydrogen bombs. We've got MIRV missiles. See, and we can send up, a dozen at a time. We've got submarines that can blow up the whole world just cruising around, waiting for the instructions. You saw the movie. What is it? Red Tide or something? No.
Hunt for Red October.
Hunt for Red October. Ready to push the button. And let loose a couple dozen. So what happens to a God who is more powerful than the most frightening powers that we can devise? All of a sudden, we've got to have a God who is, wow, really big. But we've got a problem. David could say, God is my sword and my buckler. But do we want to sing about God being our MIRV missile? God is my MIRV missile. You gotta wipe out my enemies. You know, I mean, if I could sing, you know, we could make a great song, you know. You know. God is my U2 in the sky, you know. Is that the kind of God we want? A God that can unleash a nuclear holocaust upon our enemies? That thought is actually frightening to us. We don't want that kind of a God. We don't want a God that can paralyze us with the kind of fear that's already paralyzing us about the nuclear winter that we anticipate could take place if we let go with some of the power we've got. So we kind of neutralize it. We talk about he's an awesome power. He's a power greater than ourselves. But we've kind of stripped it of specificity because nobody wants a God who is a Kalashnikov rifle or a M16 automatic. God's my truckload of dynamite. Doesn't wash for us. We want a God who's powerful, but who's not frightening. And so what we tend to do is we tend to distance God and put that power at a nice safe distance. But in doing that, we now run into a problem in our culture. If God is so powerful and so distant, how do we make contact with him? And you know what? We end up having to balance that confidence in God's power by then balancing it out with terms of endearment. And so that's our next category, terms of endearment. See? Well, what are some of the terms of endearment? Lover of my soul. Do you ever sing about God as being lover of our soul? God is our comforter. God is the one who cares for us. All of a sudden we bring him back. We bring him back as someone who can meet our every need. Someone who can pick us up. Someone who can wipe the tears away. And all of a sudden that very, very distant God is all of a sudden made very imminent and close, very active in our lives. And this is very, very important because you see, if you're going to have the one, you have to have the other. Well, what else do we have? We have terms that I call democratic social structural terms. What do we mean by democratic social structural terms? I'm referring here to almost those flippant discussions about who God is. He's my co-pilot. God is the captain of my soul. God is the man upstairs. God is the coach. God is the big guy. God's the head cheese. Why do we call him all these terms? Because, you see, as a democratic society, we are not really in tune to kings, barons, lords. We're not a hierarchical society. We're an egalitarian type of society. And so we need a God who has some power and authority, who has leadership roles, but our leadership roles are kindly what is the term I want to use? Derogatory. So, he's our coach. But we all know we have to give Coach honor. You know, we got to do what Coach says. He's the man upstairs, and yet we recognize that we've got to listen to him. He's the big cheese. See? He's the boss. Let me talk to the boss about it. So while there's a kind of a flippancy about our attitude toward God, there's still an acknowledgement that he has the right to leadership, but it's leadership that is more appropriate to our kind of democratic culture. Well, the fourth category is terms of companionship and helping, and we often talk about God in terms of being a friend. What a friend we have in Jesus, for instance, of being a husband, and of other terms in which Jesus is seen as walking side by side with us in a companionship type of imagery. Now, why? Why these particular sets of terminologies? Well, again, today's God is imaged in terms of individual need fulfillment and personal relationships. And it does so in a manner that maintains our culture's social values. Now, let's reflect again. We've moved through three very distinctive time periods. We've moved through three very distinctive cultural settings. We've moved from a very agricultural, semi-nomadic, aggressive culture to a newly politicized, settled community that's beginning to expand into agricultural or into mercantile economy. We are still pre-industrial, but we've at least begun to develop major cities, major trade routes, greater specialization. Then we move up to a very highly industrialized culture, very technologically advanced, and we get three different sets of images as to who God is. Now, this ought to set some bells ringing, and it ought to cause us to ask a very important question, and that question is God nothing more than a cultural creation of human beings? Is God nothing more than a cultural creation of human beings? Did we just make God up? Now, I ask this question, see, because a very famous sociologist and anthropologist by the name of Emil Durkheim, see, came to the conclusion that God is nothing more than another term for humanity. That heaven is nothing more than a mirror image of earth. That what we have in God and in all of the religious systems of the world is a mirror reflection of earthly societies. And that what we do is we create our earthly societies, but we need some kind of a heavenly version of that in order to authenticate and give authority to our earthly societies. So he said, it's really nothing more than an invention of the human mind and of cultural institutions. Now, how do you respond to a person like Emil Durkheim? We've got dozens of students who are taking anthropology and sociology classes in secular universities who are being fed this line, and how do we respond to it? Is Emil Durkheim right, or is he wrong? And how do we deal with Durkheim's kind of argument? Can we falsify it, or can we disprove it? Well, we're not going to be able to answer all of those questions tonight. I mean, this is a marvelous theoretical issue that needs to be dealt with, and we try to deal with this in some of our other classes around the place. But I introduced the problem to you now because, you see, in some respects, Emil Durkheim is right. You know why he's right? Because sinful humanity does create its own concept of God. Romans 1:23 states that man, having rejected the concept of God, has created God in their own image. So we have created our own gods. Emil Durkheim has it right, but he's only partly right. See, he does explain the fact that cultures do create their own gods, that these gods have been created for the purpose of meeting their particular sinful predispositions and even their cultural institutions. But, and you notice that little but underneath of that? But is that the total answer? And I'm not convinced that it is. I'm convinced that Emil Durkheim missed one more important component. The fact of the matter is, God can only manifest himself within the limitations of man's finiteness. How can God make himself known to us? He cannot manifest himself to us in concepts that we cannot understand, in words that are not in our vocabularies, in images that are outside of our culture. You could not have talked to John Wesley, as godly a man as John Wesley was, about God being like a computer. Like a what? Never heard of a computer. Had no idea about information flowing through machines and over wires. That was totally beyond his realm of perception. And you couldn't say, God is like a mighty fax machine. God is like an IBM.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.